After 2.5 years with the game, I finally got to the end of Elden Ring. So today, I'm going to be giving my full spoiler-free review of the game. My name is James, and I started this channel simply because I love video games. If that sounds like you, please subscribe to my channel so you can see more videos just like this one. Elden Ring came out February 25th, 2022 for Xbox One, Xbox Series X, PS4, PS5, and PC. I played the game on my Xbox Series X, and I sunk 92 hours into it over the course of about a month. I don't remember changing any settings or options early on. I did, however, make sure the game was in performance mode, and I was good to go from there. As always, I will be doing my best to avoid spoilers. However, in this video, I will be mentioning specific enemy types, weapons, locations, and I'll be speaking more broadly about different bosses without mentioning their names. And with all of that out of the way, let's get started with the positives. Kicking off the positives, I got to mention the atmosphere. FromSoft did an incredible job of crafting this world that's dark and mysterious and intriguing and scary, and it really makes you want to run around and fight anything that you can see, while also exploring different areas and kind of seeing what different enemies are about and talking to different NPCs and going to the different shops, and it makes you want to it makes you want to experiment with different items and weapons and see what they do. And the atmosphere of the game did a really great job of setting the tone and creating an expectation of how you are set to interact with the game. Along those same lines, the entire world feels like it was handcrafted, it lived in and alive, and it feels familiar without feeling old. Those feelings of familiarity create this They spark something inside of you that makes you want to go and explore different caves and catacombs and see what's around. And so the next thing that I feel like I've really got to talk about here is exploration. The exploration feels both natural and rewarding. I don't remember a single time in the game that I went off the beaten path to go see what was going on over there and then thought like, oh, I shouldn't have wasted my time doing this. The different caves and catacombs, many of which have their own different kind of enemy types and their own bosses inside of them, were lots of fun for me to explore. They reminded me of dungeons in Skyrim, and I enjoyed those so much that later in the game, when I was looking for a way to kind of go up a few levels to get stronger, I started looking up where caves and catacombs were so that I can go and experience all of the ones that I missed. Along those same lines, the different dungeons and castles and towns and settlements that you go through as part of just the main story in this game also are incredibly fun to explore. That there were points that I was a little bit disappointed that you didn't have separate dungeon maps for the different, for like Stormvale Castle or Lendell or Lendell City, so that I could make sure to see everything that they were hiding there. Running off and exploring was a really great way to find different kinds of enemies and different kinds of new weapons and learning new abilities. And another thing that I really enjoyed was the one-on-one combat with your more common enemies, like your Stormvale Knights, your Godric soldiers, your any of those people. being able to kind of memorize their attack patterns and understand their timings and exploit that, and learning and getting off a perfect parry with a shield and then getting them with a spear or something like that added to this power fantasy that made you feel like you were completely invincible for the time being. It really cannot be overstated how much I enjoyed all of these parts of the game, because I enjoyed them enough to keep me going for 90 hours, which I don't know when the last time I put 90 hours into a game was. And so with that, we're going to have to go, we're going into the mixed category. So the top of the list here is that the game really doesn't teach you very much. And the reason that this is in mixed and not in negative is because I feel like part of that is a me problem, because I'd never played any other FromSoft games, so I wasn't familiar with a lot of the systems that created over the last, 5 or 6 games. But I do also feel like they should have a little bit more of a tutorial there, because I do think that a lot of people were playing this as their first FromSoft game, especially when you consider, like, they wouldn't have known this when they were making the game, but especially considering the buzz that was around it at launch and really for all of 2022. I would have liked for them to have taught me how to do a little bit more, because even very late in the game, I still wasn't entirely sure how, like, perfect parries work, and I was actually fighting the final boss, when I learned that you could, like, mix your own potion with different, like, orbs that you've been finding around, so you could drink your own potion and, like, make your health slowly go up and stuff. Having to figure out a lot of that stuff on your own is one of the weaker points of the game for me. Another mixed thing for me, I wrote down the grind. And early in the game, when I was exploring a lot of new areas and seeing a lot of stuff for the first time, I felt like I was leveling up pretty quickly, that I was gaining runes and kind of finding bosses and killing them and getting more runes. And as the game progressed, it was like, okay, I'm getting to a boss. This boss is kind of tough. I'm going to go to this area over here that has enemies that I know I can beat. And I'm going to spend, 10 or 15 minutes hacking up these enemies so that I can level up 1 or 2 more times to be able to get a little bit stronger to beat this boss. And then that amplified the further that you got into the game, to the point where when I got to the final boss, I think I was around level, 120, maybe 130. But then when I beat the final boss, I think I was closer to 170. I probably had to go up about 40 levels. I did a lot of grinding, and so the reason that the grind is mixed for me was because early on I felt like I wasn't doing much grinding, because my natural exploration was just kind of soaking up what would have been the grind earlier in the game. And then later on in the game, I was running out. I got to a point where it was like, I don't know where I haven't been, so I can't really go explore new areas. So I feel like I have to go and grind. And by the end of the game, it was taking probably about 100,000 runes to go up 1 level, which is a lot of runes. And then going up, and by that point, going up 1 level barely even makes a noticeable difference in your build. And when I got to that point, I felt like I was doing way more. I was spending more time grinding than I was actually progressing, and that felt frustrating. The next thing that I have written down is status effects. Wearing different kinds of armor and clothing and equipping different items will boost different stuff. It'll boost your, like, immunity or, like, poison resistance and all this stuff. However, a lot of the stuff's really not explained very well. That I understand that, like, boosting your immunity is probably gonna help with your poison resistance, but when I'm riding my horse through a field and a little yellow thing starts filling up, and then all of a sudden my horse dies and I fall over and it says that I was killed by madness, it was like, what the hell? Like, what am I? What trait affects sanity? Like, there's not a sanity. But there's not a. Can I get like a cloak of sanity that makes me not go mad when I'm riding my horse? And I found that kind of stuff to be very frustrating. That one I could. So the madness one I could actually put up with a little bit, because madness wasn't an instant kill. However, there's one of them that I have no idea how to build up the immunity to it, and it's a straight up instant kill. It was an instant kill even when my vigor was at level like 80, and I honestly just never found out how to avoid it. The next thing that I have written down is the targeting and a camera. For the first 60 hours that I played the game, I felt like the targeting and the camera was really good. It was locking on to enemies that I meant to lock on to, but then after I crossed the 60-hour mark, whenever I was in a crowd of, and whenever there were multiple enemies on screen, I often felt like it was locking on to the wrong enemy. That it's like there's 5 enemies in a room and 4 of them are asleep and one of them is like walking at me, and I click the stick to lock onto it, but instead of locking onto him, it locks onto this one. Like, instead of locking onto this one that's coming right at me, it locks onto this one like over here, and so I'm like raising my shield and like swinging, but I'm not swinging in the right direction because it locked onto the wrong one. And this wasn't just a one-time thing. This was happening constantly. And sometimes even in boss battles, when I would try to lock on to a boss, I would be running this way over here, and the boss would be kind of over there where my camera is. I would manually turn the camera to face the boss, and I would click the stick where my character was still facing this way, and it like wouldn't recognize that the boss was there. And then when you click the targeting thing, when there are no enemies around, it puts the camera directly behind you. So what it would do is it would shift the camera very drastically, and the boss would then be off screen for a few seconds, and oftentimes that could result in me dying. Next thing I need to talk about is messages. Messages are cool most of the time. Apparently, this is not a new thing for Elden Ring, but this was my first time experiencing like the spirit messages that you can leave for other players and stuff. Mostly found them really cool. Found a lot of cool items by listening to them, all that stuff. They would say stuff like, be like ahead enemy from the right, or something like that. And so kind of like, oh, watch the right side as I go down this hallway because an enemy might pop out, or something like that. A lot of them were really cool. It actually kind of reminded me of Death Stranding and being able to kind of interact with other players to be able to interact with other players without really interacting with other players. And I found that to be very cool. However, there were many points that I felt like a lot of the messages got in the way, that people, for some reason, would put their messages over a site of like sites of grace. And there was one point specifically that I was being chased by an enemy and I saw a site of grace and I was running for it, and I got to it and then I hit Y to rest at the site of grace, but somebody had put a message right over the top of the site of grace, and I didn't realize it. So I actually just ran over and read the message and died. People would put messages right next to the yellow barriers to enter like a boss area. And so there was one area late in the game where the general enemies in this area were very strong, and so I was trying to sprint past all of them to get to the boss. And you have to hit Y. When you get up there, you have to hit Y to be able to cross that barrier. So once again, I'm being chased by enemies, and I get up to where I'm trying to get to safely. And then I hit Y, and instead of interacting with what I'm trying to interact with, it just reads a message. And by the time I clear the message or something, I've already been hit and nearly killed. So annoying again. And now we're going to get into the negatives of the game. And I really feel like it's important to say, I know that I talked a long time about the mixed, and I have quite a few negatives that I'm going to be going through too. I don't want anybody to think that I didn't enjoy this game. I wouldn't have played the game for 90 hours if I didn't love it. That being said, very top of my negative list, invading players, invading NPCs. I pretty much always just found them to be super annoying. I very quickly turned off multiplayer, so I wasn't getting any actual invading players, but you still get the invading NPCs, and for some reason, the invading NPCs are always super strong, like way stronger than the other enemies in an area, which I guess if they're supposed to simulate like other players, they should kind of be at your level. But invading NPCs were never fun for me because I always felt like they were either way stronger than me or way weaker than me, and neither of those scenarios are very fun. Next thing that I have written down is getting knocked off cliffs by enemies. This was more of an issue early in the game when my armor was a little bit weaker and it was easier for me to get knocked over. Later on in the game, you do a lot of climbing and traveling and jumping off of rooftops and walking around in trees and doing all this stuff. And it seems that pretty much any enemy can knock you over. And if you're standing too close to an edge, there's a pretty good chance that they'll just knock you over the edge. I get why it's like that, but if enemies can kill you by knocking you off the edge, I feel like it shouldn't be so easy for them to do it. And that goes for bosses too. I mentioned earlier in the positive section the one-on-one combat with your common enemies. Down in the negative section, I have to mention combat against multiple enemies. If you can keep them all in front of you to kind of either slash like all of them as a group or do magic on the group or something. But if you ever had one enemy in front of you and one enemy behind you, the likelihood I don't know about you, the likelihood of me winning that was pretty much zero. Because what would happen is that one guy would poke you from the back, and every time he hits you, your character would go like, blah, and like take a second to kind of give you movement back. But before you would basically just end up getting stun locked by them just going like poke, 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 like they're some cats playing with a bobblehead. And I didn't find that to be fun. Any time that happened, I found it to be frustrating, and that could be avoided by kind of, I guess, positioning yourself in a way that they don't stagger you like that. But the way the enemies are placed in certain areas, they're placed in a way that's designed for them to kind of flank you in different directions, which is why this is negative for me. The next thing that I wrote down was that a good chunk of the bosses in the game felt like they were just huge and cheap. Pretty much the entire game, I was having an issue where bosses would do this flurry of attacks where they would hit you like 4 or 5 times, and then obviously they break your stamina and then you get knocked down, and then you take like a year to stand back up. And it felt unfair to me that I lose control and that it takes so long to stand back up, and they can continue hitting you while you're on the ground and while you're standing back up. That kind of goes into a feeling of clunky design, and there were points in the game where I felt like the design was intentionally clunky to make the game more difficult, or like maybe even like more annoying. Specific examples of this: enemy attacks can clip through walls and barriers, but yours can't. Which means if you're in like a tight hallway with an enemy, I used a spear, which was like a straight lunge for some of the game, but I also used a katana, which was more of like a swing around weapon. And that often if I was in hallways using the katana, I would swing and then I would get to about here and it would hit the wall and it would just like cancel the attack. However, if an enemy is swinging at you and their sword would like hit a wall or something, it just goes right through the wall and they hit you anyway. And so it felt unbalanced in that way. That was most noticeable in some of the catacombs when you were fighting undead. And then another thing here is that some of your undead, there were these like zombie enemies and some skeletons. You deplete their health bar and then you have to hit them again once they're like on the ground to be able to actually like kill them, or they'll just get right back up and you have to take their health down again. The part that felt clunky and kind of cheap to me was that for both the skeletons and those zombie guys, once you got their health down and they drop, you can't lock onto them anymore. So it made it difficult to actually hit them when they were on the ground, especially earlier on in the game. I was playing a magic build, and so you pretty much have to lock on to be able to shoot magic at people, at enemies. And so I didn't really care for that either. There was an optional area that I was exploring very late in the game, and I think they did it like this because this area is supposed to be kind of hard. There were enemies that would, so you're like running around in a big tree. And so you're like, you have to kind of stay on the branches and you can't really do any dodging or rolling or any of that because you would fall off the tree and die. And it's littered with enemies that shoot projectiles at you. It felt like they didn't know how to make this section hard, so they just made it really annoying, which maybe that is making it harder and I'm just bad at the game, but I found that to be frustrating as well. I actually found that, so I mentioned that was an optional area. I found that frustrating enough that I got fed up with that area and I left and I never went back. And then the last thing that I have to say, my biggest negative with the game is really that it took me 3 different attempts, 3 different characters, 3 different new games in order to get into the game. My biggest problem with the game is that I didn't get it. I didn't get it for... I tried to play it first for about 5 to 10 hours, and then again for another 30 hours, and both times I just wasn't having fun and ended up walking away. That's everything I have to say about Elden Ring. Guys, in the comment section, let me know what you love about this game. Make sure to check out some of my other videos. And as always, the best way to keep up with me is on Instagram and on Twitter at James_Solar. Thanks, guys.